February 20th, 1944, the largest air armada in history takes flight. The cold came first, sharp, biting, relentless. Before dawn had broken over the flat, muddy fields of East Anglia, England, thousands of young American airmen were already awake, huddling in mess halls and briefing rooms, sipping lukewarm coffee as they waited for the inevitable announcement. Most were barely out of high school. Some had never kissed a girl. Many had never even flown in an airplane until months earlier. Yet here they sat, armed with flight jackets and quiet prayers, listening for the words they had been dreading and anticipating for weeks. Today's the day. At that simple, understated phrase, a collective breath seemed to leave the room. Helmets were adjusted. Letters home, half-written and tucked into pockets, suddenly felt heavier. Cigarettes burned faster. They all knew what was coming. An operation unlike anything the world had ever seen. A strike at the very heart of Hitler's war machine, designed to cripple Germany's aircraft production once and for all. Outside, the bases came alive under the dim light of freezing fog. Ground crews moved with grim urgency, their boots crunching over frost-laden tarmac. By flashlight and lantern, they loaded 500-pound bombs into the bellies of the mighty B-17 flying fortresses, great lumbering beasts with names painted in bold, hopeful letters. Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, the Fighting City of Baltimore, Heaven Can Wait. Mechanics wiped oil-stained hands on cold overalls as they double-checked engines. Armorers cursed the numbness in their fingers as they clipped in belts of .50 caliber ammunition, each round a tiny insurance policy against the predatory Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs they knew would soon be tearing into the formation. In one corner of Thorpe Abbott's airfield, Lieutenant Robert Rosie Rosenthal of the famous 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, climbed into his fortress. He would later remember, "We could hear the ice cracking off the wings as we taxied. The weather was terrible, but so was the pressure. We had to break the Luftwaffe's back." Rosenthal's words captured the impossible weight pressing down on every man that morning. They weren't just flying a mission, they were taking part in what would become known as Big Week, a brutal, calculated gamble to seize control of the skies over Europe in preparation for the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The magnitude of the operation was staggering. 1,000 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, stretching wingtip to wingtip across the runways. 900 escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the sleek new P-51 Mustangs, poised to weave and dive through the skies to protect them. Never before had such a concentration of air power been assembled. Never before had so much depended on so few so young. In the chilly pre-dawn gloom, navigators unfolded creased maps under red-lit lamps, tracing their gloved fingers over the long, perilous route, over the North Sea, across Holland, deep into Germany, to Leipzig, the heart of the Reich's aircraft production empire. The crews knew the risks. They knew the flak batteries over the target would be murderous, thick enough to walk on, throwing up steel storms that could shred a bomber like paper. They knew the Luftwaffe would come, veterans of the Eastern Front, desperate and deadly, some diving at them from the sun with guns blazing, others firing rockets into their tight formations. They had seen too many empty bunks after previous missions. They had watched friends vanish into fireballs, their planes spiraling down in black smoke, tiny parachutes blooming too late, or not at all. Yet still, as the first engines roared to life, the deep bone-vibrating growl of 4 Wright Cyclone engines apiece, the men climbed aboard. They settled into freezing, cramped cockpits, behind waist guns and in nose compartments fogged by their own breath, and waited for the signal to roll. One by one, the great silver birds lumbered down the runways, struggling to lift their massive weight into the low-hanging fog, their wings heavy with death and hope alike. They climbed into a sky so thick with condensation and exhaust trails that it looked like a second ground beneath them. A gray, swirling world where death might come from any direction, at any second. As the sun struggled to break through the haze, the magnitude of it all became visible. An endless river of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon, shimmering in the cold morning light. The sky itself seemed to hum with the combined heartbeat of the Armada. Thousands of young souls straining against gravity, against fear, against the odds. Ahead of them lay Leipzig, and beyond it, the hope that if they struck hard enough, fast enough, they could end the killing, shorten the war, save lives. But first, they would have to survive the day. And in the freezing fog of East Anglia, on February 20th, 1944, the greatest air armada in history took flight, and the skies of Europe would never be the same again. The plan. Operation Argument. In the darkened war rooms of England, behind heavy blackout curtains and tables crowded with maps and photographs, a desperate plan had been drawn up. One that would gamble thousands of young American lives against the future of the entire war in Europe. The plan was codenamed Operation Argument, though among the men who would fly it, a far more fitting nickname quickly spread: Big Week. The logic behind it was as brutal as the war itself. Objective: shatter the German fighter force by destroying its aircraft industry, the factories that churned out Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and the fearsome new jets in development. Strategy: strike the industrial heart of the Third Reich with relentless, daylight precision bombing, forcing the Luftwaffe to rise and defend its factories, and thus expose its dwindling numbers of pilots and planes to annihilation. Risk: accept staggering American casualties to achieve air superiority, the one indispensable condition for the planned D-Day invasion just a few months away. It was a bloody wager, and everyone involved knew it. General Karl Spaatz, architect of the American strategic bombing campaign, said it plainly: "If we don't cripple the Luftwaffe, we can't land in France, period." And so, under skies heavy with freezing mist and the dull promise of flak storms to come, February 20th, 1944, marked the opening gambit of Big Week. At 0730 hours, the first waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators began to lift off the runways across East Anglia. Their engines thundered in a symphony of raw mechanical power, shaking the frozen ground and rattling the teeth of ground crews who watched with silent prayers. It was a spectacle of impossible scale, squadron after squadron after squadron rising into the gray morning like iron phoenixes, wings heavy with bombs and hope. Inside the cramped, frost-rimed cockpit of one bomber, navigator Harry Crosby peered out his window, taking in a sight that would stay with him forever. The sky looked like a floating city, Crosby would later write in his journal. As far as you could see, front, rear, left, right, above, below, nothing but B-17s and B-24s in perfect formation. It was a vision both awe-inspiring and heartbreaking. A flying metropolis built not of stone and glass, but of aluminum and bravery, soaring eastward toward a world that wanted nothing more than to tear it apart. But beyond their horizon, hidden by distance and fate, death was already on the wing. At airfields scattered across occupied Europe, over 250 German fighters, experienced killers, many with dozens of victories chalked beneath their cockpits, were scrambling into the air. Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek and brutal. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, nimble and deadly. Twin-engine Bf 110s bristling with heavy cannons. Veteran Luftwaffe, Gruppenkommandeurs barked orders as their men climbed into their battered aircraft, the cold seeping into their gloves and boots. They knew the odds were stacked against them. Fuel was short. Spare parts were even scarcer. Many were flying with patched-up machines held together by desperation and ingenuity. But this was Germany's heartland. The factories at Leipzig, Bernburg, and Halberstadt, all targets for the day, were irreplaceable. They had to be defended, no matter the cost. As the American bombers leveled off at cruising altitude, unknowingly hurtling toward the ambush, the trap was already being set. First would come the long-range flak batteries, vomiting black, greasy explosions into the path of the oncoming formations. Then, as the fortresses and liberators weaved through the flak curtains, the fighters would pounce, diving at 400 miles per hour through tight bomber boxes, their cannons ripping aluminum and flesh with terrifying efficiency. Big Week had begun, and both sides understood what was truly at stake. For the Americans, the prize was control of the air, the ability to launch D-Day and bring the Nazi regime to its knees. For the Germans, it was survival, the defense of their homeland, their cities, their very families from the relentless Allied advance. And so, thousands of young men, none older than 24, hurtled toward one another over the fields and factories of Europe, drawn together by a force greater than any of them could resist. What Crosby and the men of the 8th Air Force could not see, as their floating city drifted eastward under a rising sun, was that by day's end, hundreds of them would be dead or missing, their bodies scattered across frozen forests and burning towns. But still they flew, still they believed, still they fought for a future they might never live to see, because the mission mattered, because freedom mattered, because even if the sky was filled with death, it was also filled with hope, and that, too, is a weapon. The killing skies over Leipzig. At 30,000 feet, over the icy heart of Germany, the clear winter sky shattered into chaos. For hours, the armada of B-17s and B-24s had flown on, a mile-wide steel procession crawling eastward toward Leipzig, their engines humming in perfect mechanical rhythm. Below them, snow-covered fields and villages blurred past. Above, a thin, bitter sun glinted off gun barrels and aluminum skin. The men inside the bombers, sweating inside fleece-lined flight suits despite the sub-zero temperatures, waited in a kind of suspended dread, eyes scanning the limitless blue for the inevitable. It began without warning. First contact, 11:30 hours. From the distant haze ahead, the FW-190s came screaming down, squat, brutal killers painted in the dull gray and yellow of the Luftwaffe. They dove straight through the bomber formations at over 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing, scattering broken aircraft and bodies in their wake. Hot on their heels, the nimble Me-109s swooped in, selecting wounded bombers and isolated stragglers for execution. Their 20mm cannons tore through fuselages like tissue paper, sending engines erupting in smoke and fire, wings peeling away like burning leaves. Somewhere along the dense bomber stream, the B-17 Wee Willie took a direct hit from flak, just as the fighters made their first run. In an instant, less time than a man could shout, the entire aircraft disintegrated in a searing fireball, pieces of wing and fuselage cartwheeling through the formation. All 10 men aboard were simply gone, erased in a blinding flash witnessed by stunned comrades who had no time to mourn, because the next wave was already upon them. The furball, 1200 to 1230 hours. For half an hour, the sky above Leipzig became a swirling vortex of death. American P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast, dove into the fray, intercepting the German attackers with grim determination. The 357th Fighter Group, flying at the very edge of their fuel limits, clashed headlong with JG-11, the elite Luftwaffe fighter wing led by Ace Major Walter Krupinski. Dogfights spiraled from 30,000 feet to treetop level in seconds. Tracer rounds stitched the sky in lethal lattices. Explosions blossomed in midair like deadly flowers. Inside a battered flying fortress, Tail Gunner Sergeant John Quinlan leaned hard into his .50 caliber machine guns, firing until the barrels warped and steamed. "I saw a 109 explode so close," he later recalled. The debris rattled our plane like hail on a tin roof. Elsewhere, a B-24 Liberator of the 445th Bomb Group, engines shot to pieces, wings bleeding smoke, refused to fall out of formation. The pilot, ignoring every alarm and every instinct for survival, kept his crippled bird steady until the bombs were released over the target. Only then did he peel away, disappearing into the swirling mess below, fate unknown. The battle raged from horizon to horizon, 1,000 individual duels and desperate acts of courage blending into one vast, roaring symphony of war. The icy air was filled with the acrid stench of burning oil, the dull percussion of exploding shells, the shriek of falling metal. Men fought at ranges so close they could see the white fear in each other's eyes before the guns spoke. The cost. When the last bombs fell and the battered remnants of the Armada turned west for home, the butcher's bill was grim. The American forces had lost 46 bombers and 16 fighters, more than 500 men killed, missing, or captured over enemy territory. Entire crews had vanished without a trace, their bombers spiraling into the snowy fields below, where German civilians would later find twisted wreckage half buried in the mud. And yet, in the midst of tragedy, there was achievement. American gunners and fighter pilots had claimed 83 confirmed kills against the Luftwaffe. A devastating blow to a force that could no longer replace its lost men and machines. And most importantly, the target itself, Leipzig's Allgemeine Transportgesellschaft, ATG, aircraft factory, had been 80% destroyed in the bombing. Dozens of Messerschmitt fighters under construction were obliterated, machine tools, assembly lines, and warehouses reduced to smoldering ruins. It was a crippling wound to Germany's ability to defend itself, and a crucial step toward breaking its air power once and for all. But no one among the survivors celebrated as they limped back across the channel. The radios crackled with missing call signs, empty spaces yawned in once full formations. In the long, frozen hours back to England, staring through cracked and blood-smeared plexiglass, each man knew they had won a victory today, but it had been bought dearly, paid for in blood and courage 30,000 feet above the earth. And tomorrow, they would have to do it all again. Inside the flying coffins, for the young airmen sealed inside their B-17s and B-24s, combat missions like Leipzig were not just battles. They were ordeals of endurance and terror that tested the limits of human survival. Each mission stretched nearly 7 endless hours, much of it spent at altitudes where the temperature outside plummeted to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the aircraft, conditions were barely better. Frost rimed the guns, froze oxygen masks to faces, and turned any exposed skin into brittle, blistered flesh. Gunners wore layers of electrically heated suits, but even these often short-circuited or failed. Many suffered frostbite so severe that fingers and toes turned black mid-mission, unnoticed until they tried, and failed, to pull a trigger. When flak shells burst among the formations, spraying shrapnel like grape shot, wounded men had to be treated with frozen bandages, stiff, ice-caked rags wrapped around bleeding arms or legs in the desperate hope of stemming blood loss until landing. Medics, huddled in the dim, vibrating interiors, struggled to work with numb hands as the cold sapped life from the injured faster than the wounds themselves. And if disaster struck, a direct flak hit, a fighter shredding control cables, a runaway engine fire, the command to bail out came without mercy. To leap from a crippled bomber meant parachuting into the unknown, swirling snow, black smoke, and a hostile land filled with Germans who would not offer mercy. Radio operator Frank Murphy of the 100th Bomb Group lived one of the war's most harrowing stories. During the Leipzig mission, his B-17 was cut in half by cannon fire, the tail section shearing away with a sickening crunch. Murphy was thrown through the bomb bay, tumbling into open sky alongside the bodies of 2 of his dead crewmates. I remember the silence, he said later. One moment, the engines were roaring in my ears. The next, just silence, and the sight of two of my friends floating lifeless beside me. Miraculously, at 8,000 feet, Murphy managed to pull his ripcord, the parachute blooming above him in a jolt that nearly wrenched his arms from their sockets. He drifted downward, past burning bombers, past shredded parachutes, until he crashed into a tree in a frozen German forest. When he looked up, dazed, he found himself surrounded by angry civilians armed with pitchforks and hunting rifles. Frank Murphy survived Leipzig, but he would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp, haunted by the memory of those frozen bodies tumbling through the sky. They called their bombers flying fortresses and liberators, but among the crews there was another more brutal name whispered in the freezing fuselage: flying coffins. Why Big Week changed everything. For all the horrors endured over Leipzig and throughout Big Week, the brutal sacrifice bore fruit, perhaps more decisive than any single air campaign before or since. Production crisis. The strikes, relentless and devastating, shattered Germany's ability to sustain its fighter aircraft production. While the German industry attempted to relocate and rebuild, it never fully recovered. New planes would roll off assembly lines, but increasingly without enough trained pilots to fly them. Pilot drain. Perhaps more crippling than the loss of machines was the loss of irreplaceable Luftwaffe veterans. The aces who had fought through the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and North Africa, men who could teach rookies, spot ambushes, and outfight multiple opponents, were dying at catastrophic rates. With each mission, Germany's skies were manned more and more by green recruits, often with only a few dozen hours of flight time before facing battle-hardened American fighter pilots. D-Day assurance. By breaking the Luftwaffe's back, the Allies did something no strategy or deception plan could accomplish. They made Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, viable. Had German fighters still ruled the skies in June 1944, the beaches of Normandy would have run red with Allied blood under relentless aerial attack. Instead, on D-Day, American, British, and Canadian forces landed under skies where friendly aircraft outnumbered enemy fighters 20-1. Years later, reflecting on the significance of that cold week in February 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, the same Doolittle who had led the daring raid on Tokyo, wrote, "That week in February broke the German Air Force's will. After Leipzig, they never truly challenged us again." Big Week was a turning point few civilians understood at the time, obscured by the vastness of the war. But for those who fought in the skies, and for the thousands who would later survive to land on French beaches, it marked the moment when the tide of air power, and perhaps of the entire war, irrevocably turned. The cost had been terrible, but the skies over Europe now belonged, finally, to the Allies. The boys who never came home. For many in the audience who lived through these times, or who carry the memory of those who did, the sacrifice of the air war over Europe is not an abstract chapter in history books. It is something felt in the quiet spaces of memory. An empty chair at the dinner table, a photograph of a young man in uniform fading on a mantel, a name etched in stone half a world away. The empty chairs. Across small towns and cities from Maine to California, the price was devastatingly real. By war's end, 26,000 USAAF airmen had died in the skies over Europe, more than the entire Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. Each bomber that went down carried not just 10 young men, but the hopes of families, sweethearts, and communities left behind. It was not a matter of if, but when. The odds were brutal. Only 1 in 4 airmen would successfully complete the 25 missions required for a full tour before being sent home. Some units, like the infamous Bloody Hundredth, suffered such catastrophic losses that replacement crews often survived only a few missions before joining the missing. As the missions piled up, so too did the scars. Young faces grew lined long before their time. Letters home grew heavier, torn between stoic cheerfulness and the creeping fear that each goodbye might be the last. The lucky few. Those who did survive carried invisible wounds. Survivors' guilt became a lifelong companion. Many spoke of feeling as if they had borrowed the lives meant for others. The gunner who swapped places with a friend minutes before takeoff, the navigator who missed a flight due to illness and returned to an empty barracks. They came home, but they never truly left the cold skies over Germany behind. The living memorials. Today, in the heart of Germany, physical echoes of their sacrifice remain. In the industrial zones of Leipzig and beyond, visitors can still find the cratered ruins of wartime factories, twisted steel frameworks, and bomb-blasted walls swallowed by time and vines. Silent witnesses to the terrible precision and courage of the missions flown during Big Week. These scarred buildings are not just relics of the past. They are living memorials to the thousands of boys who gave up their youth, and often their lives, to cripple the Nazi war machine and pave the way for freedom's advance. Wallace Patterson, now 101 years old and one of the few remaining veterans of the air war, once shared his memory with quiet humility. "We weren't heroes. We were just kids doing a job and trying to live to see 21. His words are a reminder that behind every statistic, behind every mission report and after-action summary, stood real boys, with dreams, fears, and futures that would never be realized. As the narration softens, the camera pulls back over modern-day Leipzig, gliding over rusted beams and overgrown bomb craters. The wind whispers through the empty shells of factories once targeted by brave young crews. Then, fade to archival footage, B-17s limping home over the channel, smoke trailing from shredded engines, crews helping bloodied comrades off stretchers. Faces exhausted but defiant under battered flight helmets. Over the images, the low hum of propellers rises, a sound from a vanished era. Then slowly, the screen fades to black. Their war ended. Their sacrifice endures.